As much as BioWare's Mass Effect Andromeda attempts to masquerade itself as a realistic game, it is far from it. I'm not even going to begin to tackle the sheer abundance of glitches and game-ruining immersion breaks, as it could be 3 videos and a compilation in and of itself. But even aside all that, the game's approach to realism is fundamentally flawed from the start, because it is inherently lazy. This is not to discredit the development team of Andromeda, nor is any point I make in this video made to throw shade at any game developer, as I can't even begin to imagine the work that goes into making a game. However, for a franchise so founded on character interaction and dialogue, BioWare completely drops the ball with nearly every character in the game. To start, every character, whether alien or human, feels like an alien, with no concept of how real people react to real situations. The story of Mass Effect Andromeda is filled with a lot of weight, but you wouldn't be able to tell this from how the characters act and talk, often cracking jokes and almost basking in their own wonder. In fact, the game makes me feel like an alien playing it, as I imagine this is how other life forms would perceive human interaction. This classic over-the-shoulder angle, back-and-forth dialogue where the models have clearly not been hand-animated moves the act of simply talking to other characters in this game from a task to an inconvenience. Video games are a very special form of media because they require a building of immersion and development unlike any other platform. Video games are the only form of media that have you in direct control and place you in the game itself. Because of this, there's a lot more to factor in when trying to form things like atmosphere, tone, and experience. When you give players total creative freedom, you can't expect them to play the game exactly as you intended. Unlike a movie or a book that lay out everything as the director intended and have viewers experience it as it unfolds before them. That's why when considering dialogue in video games, you need to take into account how each and every player will experience and perceive those important interactions. We stand at a ridiculous and plain silly point of technological evolution. If you look back at even the past 20 years in the evolution of video games, our technology has evolved more than it has in the past 100 years. We have moved from learning how to make games feel fun to play, to making them fun to play and also feel like you're watching a movie. When this is done really well, it's hard to remember and consider that none of this is in fact real. Everything from the characters to the ground you stand on was programmed in such a way that it forms a full experience. It's why games take longer and longer to develop every single year, and why some AAA games have hiked their prices up to £50 and beyond in some cases. If you look at games that were released for early systems like the NES or Genesis, or even further back to even the Atari or arcade machines, there was a sole focus on gameplay and making an enjoyable experience out of hardware limitations. However, with current technology only getting better and better, and games coming out that sometimes clock in at over 100 gigabytes of storage, the sky's the limit for how realistic a game can be. In some cases, actual gameplay is only a chunk of a whole game's presentation. We're starting to get real examples of common dialogue practices you see in movies or TV shows in video games. One of these I'd like to focus on is naturalistic dialogue, making dialogue true to life, making these artificial representations of real people feel alive, with goals, cognitive thought, and human emotions. Now, this is not the only form of dialogue you can have, nor am I saying at all it's the best kind. You wouldn't compare something like a theatrical play's script to that of a TV show because it's a completely different thing altogether. I'm simply focusing on this style of dialogue as I think it becomes really interesting in the medium of video games, as you're bringing realism into something so artificial. Movies have been really trying to perfect naturalistic dialogue for years. It's hard to breathe life into this dramatized version of reality. However, in video games it's a lot harder to find strict examples of naturalistic dialogue, as the mishmash of genres and ideas can have some characters speaking naturally and some who are written more traditionally. So, my examples may not fit the mold exactly, but are definitely worth giving attention to. One of the games that has become something of a staple for character interaction and writing is The Last of Us. Most of the story is based on the chemistry between the two main characters, Joel and Ellie. This dynamic is the structure that forms the world building and development, as the way they bounce off each other unfolds both their own characters and also leads to how the player views everything through their perspectives. Every character in this game speaks how real people do. It's not just this lifeless conversation-based dialogue where one person says something and the other one says something back. Conversations don't really happen like that apart from in podcasts. You can respond physically to things. You can react to something someone has said with silence. People interrupt each other in natural flows of conversation. It's one of the most immersive presentations of interaction to date in video games, and it's become an inspiration for other games with similar presentation to story-based gameplay.
You keep babysitting long enough and eventually it's gonna blow up in your face.
Can we please just get on with it?
Here. Let's get on with it.
I'd like to expand on another one of these inspirations though, as Video Game Donkey already made an excellent video on how The Last of Us uses dialogue to form the feeling and immersion you get when playing. So instead, I'd like to talk about Red Dead Redemption 2. Rockstar's always exceeded at voicing their characters to properly fit the tone and further bring out their personality. With Red Dead Redemption 2, a new bar was set in this department, its voice acting being some of the most compelling and technically impressive in a game to date. The minute-to-minute details of this huge game are what turn it from a good game into a great game. Your camp especially is a marvel in creativity. Every character and moment-to-moment interaction was carefully thought out and brought to life by the team at Rockstar. Whether they're sitting around the campfire singing or relaxing at their stations, the whole world breathes, and when you examine its intricacies, it rewards you with its details. The main gang were voiced so perfectly that I could guess how every character sounds without ever hearing them. Their design carries an instantly recognizable silhouette, which makes them completely distinguishable from another. Arthur Morgan is one of the most inspired main characters to date. The way he delivers each line is instantly telling of his character as a whole. It's only this effective because of how real it is. There's moments where he's quiet, there are moments where he doesn't want to hear what others have to say. There are moments where he doesn't know what to say when confronted with the actions of others.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan.
Dutch is a character you watch slowly lose himself over time. This transformation can be clearly heard through his voice. You can hear the calm and collected leader position slip away from him as things start to get out of his hands, which is then taken to the logical conclusion in Red Dead Redemption 1, which takes place after the story of 2.
Who amongst you is with me? And who is betraying me? You and your friend there, the professor? We're gonna kill the both of you.
Why you want to do a thing like that?
I don't know. Sport, I guess.
By Red Dead Redemption 1, he doesn't even speak like a real person. He speaks in phrases and quotes, almost trying to convince others and himself that he's smart and collected.
Of course, pal. Whatever you think is best, I will see to it. Huh? Now, are we gonna rob a train? Sure.
Realism isn't always specifically the goal here, and I'm in no way inciting that perfection is realism. When creating atmosphere in a game, everything matters, down to the very essence of how characters talk to each other.
James!
Mary? Oh, Maria. It's you. I thought you were... Sorry. Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? You don't sound very happy to see me.
This is not how people talk to each other. The unnatural pace of conversation coupled with the voice acting that sounds like stand-in line reading is really harsh on the ears, but in the context of Konami's 2001 horror title Silent Hill 2, this delivery gives off a completely different meaning. Silent Hill 2 is not only a horror game, it's unanimous with the psychological horror genre. While the classification of psychological horror is often stamped on any new horror release that pushes the boundaries even slightly, Silent Hill 2's trippy, unnerving ambience leaves me with this unsettling feeling hours after playing, almost making me see everything slightly different after long play sessions. There is a hollow, cold feeling hanging over the game's set pieces, each of them carrying this feeling of being in a space in between spaces. That liminality feeds heavily into the feeling of the whole story and the immersion. Even putting all that aside, at this point in the game, we've been running around fighting zombies and other amalgamations for hours, and to finally end up here seeing someone who looks exactly like your wife and you talk to each other like this? It is smotheringly unnatural. It messes with your head like the rest of the game does. Even if it wasn't intentional, it still feels purposefully off.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
Atmosphere is everything. These stylistic choices in dialogue go further than their lines of code or the voice actors reading their lines. Just like the soft, old English spoken by the NPCs in Dark Souls that play into their own calming tone to soothe you, as when you see one of them, it's usually in some area of relief from the relentless difficulty of the Souls-like genre. We know intrinsically what a character should sound and speak like before they even open their mouth. It is natural human instinct. That's why when this is juxtaposed with something so atypical that completely subverts expectations, it is so effectively unnatural, whether intentional or not. Another game with a unique approach to tone in its dialogue is Skate 3. Most of the characters, especially the other skaters you come across when you're out in the world, have this awkward, juvenile tone. A lot of famous skateboarders lent their voice to the game and actually voiced themselves in the game. Although at first glance this dialogue may seem awkward because real-life skaters were hired who don't have much experience voice acting, it is fascinatingly authentic to how real skaters talk and carry themselves. So how does a game fail in this execution? Or rather, what makes game dialogue compelling? A simple solution to this would be adding voice acts into your game, but a lot of games simply don't have the budget or the scope to factor this in. So how do you work in the mundane task of reading text into the overstimulating nature of a video game? Well, it's important to note that up until recent history, examples of voice acting in video games were few and far between. With old Nintendo consoles having slivers of space on their storage, developers were forced to adapt and work within the limitations of their hardware at the time. The NES only had 5 audio tracks to work with on its hardware. That's why games sounded like this, and not this. So, developers learned far quicker how to write compelling on-screen dialogue than they've learned how to add in gripping voice acting. However, most text boxes in early console gaming were almost inconsequential to the game as a whole, usually just a few text boxes to send the main character on their way, or to add a bit of exposition in the form of a cutscene or a dispatcher type that sends the player on their merry way to an adventure. It would be simply inconceivable for developers at the time to imagine what is now possible with modern technology. With seemingly limitless game storage, you can fill your game with as many options as you can be bothered to put in. Take a game like Persona 5 for example, a game with a main story that runs about 100 hours, with frequent voice-acted cutscenes strewn throughout. On top of that, there are just as many, if not more, text boxes that pop up without any voice acting. How can a game like that stay interesting for that monstrous amount of time? Well, the main thing that keeps it interesting is its charm. Whether you're playing the game in English or the original Japanese, you can hear the personality oozing out of every character with their delivery. It's this almost over-exaggeration of character and personality that works in the game's favour, as every character that plays a big role in the story is indistinguishable from any of the other characters, along with the unique and creatively outstanding user interface, with the images of the characters speaking that pop up showing the expression they're pulling when they speak, along with all kinds of question marks and exclamation marks that pop up to add extra expression to their interactions. It's remarkably attractive, and it's what kept me from feeling the urge to skip through any of the long stretches of conversation. Other games have a similarly attractive nature to their dialogue to keep the game away from staleness, like 2017's West of Loathing, which has some of the funniest dialogue I've ever seen in a game to date. In my playthrough, I never even came remotely close to skipping any of the dialogue that popped up, because it was just such a joy to read. There are two main types of dialogue, inner and outer dialogue. Inner dialogue is dialogue that happens internally, usually presented as an inner monologue or talking to yourself. The way games utilize this is through exposition to the player. This is often seen in RPG Maker type games, with text boxes popping up saying things like, "This door is locked," or informing you when you pick up a new item. This is then intertwined with outer dialogue, which is any dialogue outwardly spoken or conversation based. Due to films not really being able to present inner dialogue on screen, this inner dialogue is usually presented as a character who goes in with the same knowledge as the viewer. An example of this is Elliot Page's character in Inception, acting as a gateway for the viewer to be able to understand the world and plot unfolding as they are being taught the same rules and history that we as viewers are being taught, with Leonardo DiCaprio's character acting as a sort of mentor. In the context of video games, both inner and outer dialogue can coexist with each other. Persona 5 utilizes this by having the inner dialogue going on to explain the little intricacies of the world. However, on top of this, you also have your team with you that are on the same plane as you in terms of information known. Persona 5 is a huge game with extremely fleshed out systems that are constantly developing and changing. The game deals with the huge amount of exposition needed to explain every part of its systems by having multiple lessons on similar topics. For example, near the start of the game, you'll often learn something from Morgana, who acts as a sort of mentor to the player, and the information presented to you will then be presented to another character who has to learn the same lesson. Persona paces this learning process out so its lessons stick with you, but don't feel too daunting. It also includes a feature to help you find previous tutorials more easily in its settings. Persona 5 splits up its dialogue-heavy segments in a way that constantly keeps the gameplay in a comfortable and exciting way. There can be long stretches of gameplay in palaces or exploring the world where there's no dialogue-heavy cutscenes or character interactions, and the other way around, with long cutscenes further developing the plot and pushing the story in a new direction. The dialogue can act as a relief and rest from the gameplay, in the same way that the gameplay can act as a hit of stimulation after a long stretch of dialogue. This makes for a constant refreshing stream of gameplay so that you're never doing the same thing for too long. A lot of games practice this method of splitting up segments. It's that art of pacing that keeps game stories from stagnating. Games like Sally Face, Kentucky Route Zero, and Night in the Woods are dialogue-focused games that break up this cycle with, forgive me for this, fairly basic gameplay. This gameplay then ramps up at points to keep the player focused and interested enough to properly enjoy the dialogue-heavy points. This simple gameplay loop is not a result of laziness, it's a method to keep an ever-increasing overstimulated audience from tuning out. Games like this became so popular that they even invented their own genre, interactive story games, pioneered by Telltale's The Walking Dead series. Anything from letting the player make their own choices to adding QuickTime events can act as a way of splitting up gameplay and pacing. However, some developers don't want to sacrifice direction and tone by splitting up their gameplay excessively. There are methods of fixing pacing issues and improving gameplay loops without outright switching from dialogue to gameplay. Sukaban Games' Valhalla is pretty much a glorified visual novel. Set in the future, you play as a bartender serving drinks to anyone who wanders into your bar. You spend almost all your time in Valhalla chatting to customers. You don't have a choice in what your character says, you can't control who comes in. The overall gameplay is very simple, except for the bartending aspect to the game. The game is also a barista simulator. Customers will ask you for a drink, which you then make for them. Although this process is also very simple, with a recipe guide and a small list of ingredients to make every drink, it acts as a great segue between topics and a way to break up gameplay without being too intrusive. The drinks you serve to customers will also affect the outcome of your conversation slightly, which further adds layers to the gameplay loop. The game features 6 different endings, and how you play can decide what ending you get. There are even endings that favour particular characters that you can reach if you preferred any certain characters during your playthrough. There is also a break in gameplay during the character's actual break in their shift, and when you go home for the night. This makes the gameplay attention-grabbing, as it actually makes me feel like I'm working a shift, and when I know in my head that there will be a break coming up in the dialogue I'm reading through, it grants me patience, which is then met by relief when those breaks do arrive. That mundane task of a 9-to-5 worker waiting for their break is actually implemented as a game mechanic, but it's there to make the gameplay more motivating. You can also change the song playing on the jukebox, which gives the player even more freedom and choices to make to keep things stimulated. Visual novels are a funny exception to these examples of ways to make compelling dialogue that I've mentioned so far. Traditional visual novels don't have breaks in gameplay, they don't have voice acting, and most of them aren't particularly charming in my opinion. It requires a special type of attentive and intelligent player to properly enjoy a traditional heavy dialogue visual novel. Unfortunately, I'm not describing myself, so you'll have to go somewhere else for visual novel recommendations. Recently, however, developers have begun to break the mold on what a visual novel can be. In fact, a certain visual novel that's come out in recent years broke into the spotlight for its unique story. If you weren't around to experience this game's popularity back in 2017, Doki Doki Literature Club is a visual novel that has you join a literature club in school with a bunch of girls, which is a pretty bog standard storyline for a visual novel of this nature. The gameplay is fairly mundane, dialogue is nothing to write home about. For most of the first act of this game, you're just playing through as you would normally play through a visual novel. That is, until you go to your childhood best friend's house to wake her up for school. It's obviously extremely shocking, and comes completely out of left field. The game starts to freak out after this, glitching and eventually restarting. When it restarts, everything is off. The character that the whole sequence just happened with isn't even here anymore, and here on out, the game starts to mess with you more and more. It turns out, under Doki Doki's mask of a cute visual novel with anime girls, it's actually a full-on psychological horror. The game lulls you into a false sense of security to then throw you for a loop. All of a sudden, that dialogue that seemed boring and mundane at first becomes layered and full of subtext that opens up a whole new story through its subtleties. It may be extreme, but this is a way to get players interested in dialogue. You begin to read every single text box with extra care, sometimes almost scared to press on and click to the next one. To get players motivated and stimulated, you have to present things to them in interesting and creative ways. Doki Doki does this through horror elements that mess with the viewer, but a developer's imagination is the limit as to how games can continue to push boundaries and showcase talent. Let's look back at Mass Effect Andromeda, with the knowledge we now have. The game completely lacks charm. The way the dialogue breaks up the gameplay isn't refreshing. It's boring and it feels like a forced procedure rather than a solution to sluggish gameplay. The game doesn't prioritize atmosphere. In fact, it outright goes against creating atmosphere with its characters constantly saying one-liners in serious situations. These are all things that I believe make compelling dialogue, and frankly, it's not much to ask for from a game company. However, there are diamonds in the rough that are pushing the boundary and taking steps in a better direction to bring outstanding experiences to audiences. It's these games that are worth talking about, not uninspired AAA games that are just released to bring in a profit. Stop supporting those, start appreciating good developers, and let's get talking. Do you see what I did there?
I know you love me. I wanna word you up into my life. Let's roll up to be